Hello, everyone. My name is Diane Conker, and I'm the director of the UCL School of Slavonic and East European Studies. And it's my great privilege and honor to welcome you to this inaugural lecture to recognize and celebrate the conferral of the rank of professor on Dr. Richard Mole. This lecture is part of a UCL tradition, a series that provides an opportunity to celebrate the achievements of our professors who are undertaking research and scholarship of international significance. And it offers insight into the strength and vitality of the arts, humanities, and social sciences at UCL. SSEES has been pleased to be part of this tradition since it joined UCL back in 1999. And I'm delighted to welcome so many of you here this afternoon to the Gustav Tuck Lecture Hall. And I also want to extend my welcome to those of you who are viewing remotely. Professor Mole will be introduced by Professor Sasha Rosneal, Provost for Equity and Inclusion and Dean of the UCL Faculty of Social and Historical Sciences. Like Professor Mole, she is a sociologist, and her work has received international acclaim. In her research, she's explored how gender, sexuality, subjectivity, and intimate life are changing, and the role that social movements and collective action play in bringing about social, cultural, and political change. I'm also pleased to welcome Professor Michael Wharton, who will provide some reflections following Professor Mole's lecture. He is Emeritus Professor of Arts and former Vice Provost at UCL, and it was he who negotiated the merger of SSEES and UCL in 1999. He subsequently won funding for the first of what would be 3 successive multi-year programs of research and postdoctoral training on interdisciplinary issues in the arts, humanities, and social sciences, which ran until 2018. And Richard Mole was an early postdoc under this program. Professor Wharton retired from UCL in 2013. He remains an active participant in European research institutions. Among his many roles, he is currently chair of CARA, the Council for At-Risk Academics, chair of the Strategic Steering Committee of PSL, University of Paris, and chair of the advisory board of the Ruskin Museum and Research Institute in Lancaster. Following his remarks, I invite you to join us in a reception in the North Cloisters to continue the celebration. And now to introduce our honored inaugural speaker, I turn the platform over to Dean Rosneal.
Thank you very much, Diane. It's a great pleasure to be here back in the Gustav Tuck Lecture Theatre after the pandemic. There were many inaugurals that didn't happen because of the pandemic, others that were delayed. So it's really wonderful to be gathered back here in person, but also with the advantage now that we live stream our inaugural lectures. So wonderful to have everyone watching on YouTube as well. Inaugural lectures are really special moments because they celebrate, as Diane said, the remarkable achievements of our colleagues, particularly in research, but also in education and in their contributions to the wider university and the wider academic community beyond the university. It's an especial pleasure to celebrate here today with Richard on his advancement to professor, which actually happened a while ago now because of the pandemic. Richard was promoted in 2019 and became Professor of Political Sociology in SSEES. He's worked at SSEES for a number of years, since 2003, first as Mellon Postdoctoral Research Fellow, then as a lecturer, and then as a senior lecturer. Before that, he'd done a PhD at LSE. Before that, an MPhil at Cambridge in IR, and originally a BA at Heriot Watt in German and Russian, which obviously gave the foundation for the research you've done since. Richard has undertaken many important roles within SSEES. He's contributed a huge amount to the development of the school as Deputy Director, Head of Research, Head of Teaching Resources, as well as Programme Director, Programme Coordinator for a number of programmes. He's got a really strong record of external funding, particularly European Commission funding, RIP. We hope not, but maybe. But you've used your funding to enormous benefit through an amazing track record of publications, particularly around the themes that we're going to hear about today, nationalism, populism and homophobia in Central and Eastern Europe. a number of books, which many of you will be familiar with. Most recently, Queer Migration and Asylum in Europe, published by UCL Press, which means that it's available to anyone, open access, so you don't have to pay, you can just download it. Highly recommended. In 2019, Soviet and Post-Soviet Sexualities, published by Routledge. Before that, 2012, the Baltic states from the Soviet Union to the European Union, by Routledge, and before that, Discursive Constitution of Identity in European Politics from Palgrave. Many special issues, and altogether a really wonderful track record of researching, putting on the agenda issues of sexuality and gender in Central and Eastern Europe, really, making the area, making this field of study your work has done, Richard, and then particularly with an interest in issues of nationalism and populism. So I'm really looking forward to your lecture, as I know everyone is, and I'm going to hand over the mic now for you to talk to us.
Thank you. Oh, actually, I have.
Oh, you've got your own?
I have
okay,
my own,
fantastic. Yeah. Over to you.
Great. Thank you very much for everybody who's come today. I know some of you have come quite far. Thank you particularly to Diane and Sasha for your very kind words. It's great to see so many current and former students. I haven't seen so many friends and family in one room since my wedding. And this time I don't have to share top billing, so it's even better. But I thought I would start, before sort of getting into the lecture, just to sort of explain how I came to be a political sociologist of sexuality and nationalism, as this wasn't the original plan. At school, I decided I wanted to be a conference interpreter, which I thought sounded very jet-set and exciting. So that's what I studied as an undergraduate in Edinburgh. But very soon I came to realize that conference interpreting is the unfortunate combination of being really, really difficult and really, really quite tedious. So I decided sort of quite early on that that's not what I wanted to do with my life. Although at that point I had no idea what I did want to do. But the advantage of studying Russian at university was that you got to spend a year in Russia. Unfortunately, our undergraduates don't have that opportunity at the moment for obvious reasons, but in September 1989, I went to Moscow for 10 months. And obviously 1989 was a big year for East European studies, and so I learned a lot just by sort of living there. But up until that point, I'd only really spent a lot of time abroad in France, Germany, and Austria. And in many ways, these countries were sort of very similar to the UK. Better food in France, better public transport in Germany, but otherwise sort of quite similar to the UK. But living in the Soviet Union was just so phenomenally different to what I had been used to that it really made me want to understand why these societies were so different to the ones that I'd grown up in. And so this sort of shifted my interest away from sort of just languages to sort of the politics and societies of the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. And my particular interest in nationalism came about as a result of my first solo trip within the USSR. Under the terms of our visas, we weren't allowed to leave Moscow, or we weren't supposed to leave Moscow, without an internal visa. And we couldn't get that unless we had an invitation from a Soviet citizen. So a friend of a friend of a friend got me that invitation. Then by the time I'd sorted out the visa, sorted out the trains, I arrived in Vilnius the day that Lithuania declared independence from the Soviet Union, which was very good timing. And so my interest from then on really sort of focused on issues of nationalism and national identity. Not just how the Lithuanians and the Latvians and Estonians managed to maintain their sense of national identity despite 50 years of occupation, but also how they harnessed that sense of national identity to sort of push for full national self-determination and the recognition of their independence. And then after 91, how they used national identity to sort of make sense of their place in the world and their sort of relations with sort of their neighbours. And so it was this focus on the relationship between national identity and foreign and security policy that I did for my PhD under the supervision of Margot Light at the LSE. And so when I arrived at UCL in 2003, I assumed that my research would continue to focus on foreign and security policy in Central and Eastern Europe, but it did not. It was a fortuitous meeting with my friend and colleague Claire Thompson, who at the time was in charge of the core course for the MA Gender Studies, and she knew that I was working on nationalism, and so she asked if I could write a lecture perhaps on gender and nationalism. I said I didn't really know that literature, but I'd give it a go. And so I read 2 articles by my colleague at SSEES, Wendy Bracewell, who'd done this amazing research on gender, sexuality, and nationality in the context of the Yugoslav wars. And after that, I was just hooked. Up to that point, I thought the study of sexuality was perhaps a bit niche. But studying sexuality and how states treat their sexual minorities is a really good sort of way to understand a state and a society's sort of norms and values and sort of political and social hierarchies. And so from that point onwards, my research has really focused on the relationship between sexuality and other aspects of social and political life. And I've been very lucky to sort of do some of this research in collaboration with some great colleagues at UCL and beyond. So one of the first collaborative projects I did was on sort of sexual health among LGBT migrants, which I did with Violeta Parutis, Chris Gary, and Fiona Burns. More recently, I've worked, given that my focus has sort of now shifted more towards Poland, and so I did a special issue with Ula Chowania-Cynewa-Majerska on sort of queering politics, politics and culture in Poland in the 21st century. More recently still, I've done a research project on homophobia and collective narcissism with my colleague Agnieszka Goleste-Zavala, and I'll be talking a bit about this research later on. And then for the first time, I've worked with a former PhD student of mine, Piotr Godzisz, on anti-LGBT hate crime policy, again in Poland. But for the past 4 or 5 years, I've worked with Jan Kubik, who's the former director of SSEES. He and I are running 2 big European-funded projects on populism. And within the larger sort of project, my own research is looking at populism and homophobia. And so that's what I'll be talking about for the rest of today's lecture. So one of the first things I always tell my students when they're writing essays is how to sort of operationalize homophobia. So there are a number of different ways of sort of measuring it, particularly when looking at sort of comparing case studies. And so one way to do that is to look at the degree of legal equality that LGBT people have in their respective societies. And so every year, ILGA, which is the International Lesbian and Gay Association, produces the Rainbow Map. And in the Rainbow Map, they sort of rank countries, all 49 countries in Europe, on a scale of 0, which unfortunately Azerbaijan is very close to, which represents a gross violation of human rights and discrimination, and 100%, which Malta is sort of every year gets closer to, which is full respect of human rights and full equality. So countries are ranked on the basis of laws and policies that have an impact on the day-to-day lives of LGBT people's human rights in different categories. Equality and non-discrimination, family, hate crime and hate speech, legal gender recognition, civil society, space, and asylum. Now, while in general you can see that the legal situation is sort of better in Western Europe than in Eastern Europe, it's too sort of simplistic to say that things for LGBT people in Western Europe are great and things for LGBT people in Eastern Europe are not. You can see that in terms of legal equality, Croatia scores higher than Italy, for example. However, one of the problems with this map is that it only looks at laws on the books and doesn't look at their actual implementation. So Montenegro scores very highly. It has a lot of good laws on its books, but it then tends to ignore them once they've sort of been adopted, unfortunately. So I think a better way to sort of look at homophobia is to look at societal support for LGBT equality. And for this, the Eurobarometer, which is the European Union's public opinion survey, is a very good way of sort of capturing that. And so they do surveys every year, but they don't always ask questions about LGBT equality. But they did in 2019. And here you can see, again, there's a sort of a general sort of split between sort of Eastern Europe and Western Europe. But nevertheless, support for LGBT equality is often, and in most cases, higher than actual LGBT equality in law. So if we look at, so how do you go backwards? Yeah. So for example, if we sort of take the case of Poland and Hungary, sort of choosing these countries because their governments are the ones that are sort of most dominated by populist parties, you can see that their scores are 13% and 30% respectively. But actually, if you sort of look on the right-hand column, you can see that almost 50% of the population of both Hungary and Poland support LGBT equality. So there's a sort of a mismatch between societal support and what sort of the laws on the books. So this would suggest that there are reasons other than societal opposition that politicians are choosing not to promote LGBT equality in their countries. And in many cases, they're actually seeking to marginalize their LGBT citizens. So the question that I want to sort of focus on today is why do populists weaponize homophobia, and how do they weaponize homophobia? So to start with, I'll just sort of briefly sort of explain what populism is, or how I'm sort of using it, and to whom populism tends to appeal as an ideology. So there are numerous definitions. The one I prefer is by Casmude and Cristobal Rovira Kaltwasser. They argue that populism is a thin-centered ideology that considers society to be ultimately separated into homogeneous and antagonistic camps, the pure people versus the corrupt elites. And they argue that politics should be an expression of the general will of the people. So they support a very sort of majoritarian understanding of sort of democracy, which tends to sort of ignore minority rights. Now, as a thin ideology, populism is always thickened by grafting it onto another ideology, so to ensure that the political message appeals to as broad an audience as possible in the specific local context. Now, the ideology differs. In Latin America, it's very often sort of associated with socialism, and so populists in Latin America tend to be left-wing, whereas in Central and Eastern Europe, populism is inevitably grafted onto nationalism, and a particular sort of nativist ethnic understanding of nationalism. Now, the appeal of populism is primarily to those who feel left behind, those who sort of fail to benefit from the economic policies championed by sort of neoliberal politicians in the sort of the 90s and the 2000s, or who feel disorientated by the rapid social and cultural change that was brought about by globalization and by the sort of the transition away from communism. Now, such economic, social, and cultural change often results in a loss of status for members of previously advantaged groups, and at the same time, greater empowerment for women and for sexual and ethnic minorities. And taken together, these processes tend to undermine the sense of entitlement of formerly privileged individuals, which populists promise to restore by offering backwardly oriented utopias and historical narratives that glorify traditional communities with ethnic, national, and cultural homogeneity. Now, this isn't exclusive to Central and Eastern Europe. The rhetoric of Donald Trump, a lot of the sort of the Brexit sort of argumentation was sort of very much based on the same sort of language. Now, as I've said, the sort of populism is really based on this sort of relationship between what are seen as the corrupt elites and the pure people. But nevertheless, the populists go to sort of great lengths to define what they mean by the pure people and to limit the definition of pure people in whose name they claim to speak. As this allows them to sort of delegitimize, to ignore any voices that oppose or challenge their rhetoric and behavior. In the Polish context, to be a true Pole is to be ethnically Polish, Catholic, and heterosexual. Anyone who is not Polish and Catholic and heterosexual is presented by populist politicians as a threat to Poland and therefore can be legitimately ignored, marginalized, or even attacked. We saw this with, initially with Polish populist response to the Syrian refugee crisis, and then more recently with response to Polish LGBTQ individuals. And so it's specifically on their response to LGBTQ polls that I will focus on for the rest of the lecture. So what I want to do for the rest of the lecture is to present some of the anti-LGBT laws and rhetoric that populist politicians in Poland have put forth, and explain why these politicians said they were introducing these laws, and then explain why I believe these politicians really introduced these laws. And then at the end, I will sort of bring it down to the level of the individual and show, present some of the results of my most recent research with Agnieszka Golec de Zavala, which looked at the impact that sort of populist discourse, nationalist discourse has on individual sense of homophobia. So to sort of look, to give a few examples from the Polish case study. So in 2019, the Polish city of Białystok, which is on the sort of the eastern border with Belarus, held its first ever equality parade. What was meant to be a public demonstration of support for sexual diversity quickly descended into violence, with thousands of far-right protesters throwing rocks and bottles at the marchers while chanting God, honor, and motherland. The attackers appealed to religion and to the nation, chimed with public proclamations by the representatives of the Polish Catholic Church and the Polish Law and Justice Party, which was the ruling party. On the day of the march, Białystok's Archbishop called on the city's residents to defend true Catholic values by attending a family picnic in one of the city's parks. While in the run-up to the European Parliament elections a few months earlier, Jarosław Kaczyński, who was the head of the Law and Justice Party, referred to the LGBT rights movement as a foreign import that threatens the Polish nation. This idea of homosexuality as a foreign import is something you hear sort of again and again in Central and Eastern Europe, because sort of LGBT people are often sort of more visible in sort of Western countries. Their rights are sort of more extensive in many Western countries. Populists can then argue that this is a Western phenomenon, it doesn't exist in our societies, therefore it's being forcibly imposed on us, therefore it's legitimate for us to sort of marginalize these communities and to sort of limit their sort of access to full rights. In the 2020 Polish presidential elections, Andrzej Duda made the fight against so-called LGBT ideology a central plank of his campaign. At one meeting, he said that his parents' generation had struggled against communist ideology for 40 years, and they didn't fight for this so that a new ideology that would appear that is even more destructive. So LGBT ideology was seen as more destructive than communism for Poland. They try to tell us that LGBT are people, but they are an ideology. One of the consequences of this framing of homosexuality was the creation of a number of LGBT-free zones in central and southeastern Poland. The legal consequences of the creation of these LGBT-free zones was rather minimal, but nevertheless, symbolically, it constructed LGBT Poles as second-class citizens in their own countries. So if you look at the way that populist politicians, not just in Poland but elsewhere, seek to legitimise their sort of homophobic rhetoric, they tend to say this much more or less the same thing. They argue that homosexuality is a threat to the nation and to its sort of traditional building block, the patriarchal family. Now, the first thing to make clear when looking at the relationship between nationality and sexuality is that there is no relationship. There's no a priori relationship between nationality and homosexuality. It's perfectly possible for individuals for whom national identity is an important part of their sense of self to be supportive of LGBT equality. However, history and a lot of research has shown that those who understand the nation to be a natural phenomenon growing out of extended kin groups are more likely to support a patriarchal gender order and absolute rules on sexuality and are thus more likely to oppose homosexuality. Populists tend to cite one or more of the following key reasons that homosexuals are a threat to the nation. First of all, they fail to contribute to its biological reproduction. Secondly, they fail to contribute to its cultural reproduction. They don't pass on the language, the norms, and the values. They fail to adhere to national stereotypes of masculinity and femininity, and they deviate from shared national norms, especially those derived from religious teaching. In the Polish context, they're often also seen as disloyal because they're sort of appealing to for support from Brussels or Berlin or London rather than from Warsaw. So the biological reproduction of the nation is maintained by means of the patriarchal family, underpinned by heteronormative conceptions of masculinity and femininity. The most important role that women can play in the nation, according to populists, is that of the mother, producing sons and daughters for the nation and inculcating in them the ethnic language and culture, while it's the men who act as the defenders and the decision makers. So the construction of gay men as weak and effeminate and lesbians as strong and masculine confuses this patriarchal gender order and the public and private roles of men and women that are central to most ethno-national discourses. As the focus of the biological reproduction of the nation presupposes it to be heterosexual, gays and lesbians, by not having children, undermine the idea of the nation as a collective, as a unified collectivity with a communal future. Even if gays and lesbians do have children, they are not contributing to the traditional family, seen as the main building block of the ethnic nation. As Jarosław Kaczyński, the leader of the Polish Law and Justice Party, said when discussing homosexuality, this threat is an attack on the family. At all times, the natural identities of boys and girls are to be questioned. The whole mechanism of preparing children for their future roles of mother and father is to be destroyed. Now, in Poland, one of the most powerful national norms is, of course, religious adherence. And the current position of the Catholic Church on homosexuality is similarly very closely tied to procreation. Same-sex acts are considered sinful in that sexuality is presented as being naturally ordered to the good of spouses and the generation and education of children. Homosexual acts do not proceed from a genuine, effective, and sexual complementarity. Under no circumstances can they be approved. That's from the Catechism of the Catholic Church. In the Polish context, having acted as the de facto Polish political opposition to the Communist Party during the period of state socialism, the Polish Catholic Church acquired even greater legitimacy and political power after 1989. Establishing its hegemony as the ultimate arbiter of national values, particularly those with reference to gender and sexuality. And far from restricting its views to the pulpit, the Catholic Church actively lobbied successive Polish governments in the 1990s to ensure that their issues on issues relating to sexuality was in line with Catholic dogma. Yes, so this is a sort of a nice snapshot of the sort of the LGBT ideology alongside fascism and communism as the three great threats to sort of the Polish nation. So now I just sort of want to present my ideas as to why I think they were really sort of against homosexuality. So first of all, choosing to scapegoat the queer community makes political sense for populists for a number of reasons. First of all, attacking homosexuality allows politicians to shore up support among their conservative voters by claiming that they're protecting traditional values from the spread of Western liberal values. In addition, as support for LGBT equality is considered a specifically liberal value, attacking homosexuality is a very useful way for populists to delegitimize liberal politics in general. Even if more liberal politicians in the state are not specifically advocates of LGBT rights, the association between homosexuality and liberalism is enough to discredit liberal politics more generally. Also, populists are able to use LGBT rights as a lightning rod to divert attention away from political problems that they may be having at home. This was particularly clear in Russia in 2013 when they introduced the gay propaganda law, and in Hungary last year when they introduced a sort of a law along the same lines. So the sort of discussion so far is sort of looking at the very sort of upper level of sort of Polish politics, sort of why sort of populist politicians seek to sort of limit the rights of LGBT people, and they do it in, so they say, in defense of the nation. And so this idea that homosexuality is a threat to the nation is in line with a lot of research which shows that sort of nationalism is used to legitimise sort of populist rhetoric and behaviour. But such research doesn't show the extent to which populism or nationalism can have an effect on an individual's support or not for LGBT equality. So a colleague of mine, Agnieszka Golec-Zavala, and I, we did a project looking to measure the extent to which nationalism best predicts, strength of nationalism in an individual best predicts sort of whether or not they will or will not be homophobic. But one thing that we sort of noted at the beginning was that we thought that the term nationalism was sort of too broad. That sort of nationalism could sort of mean too many things, and it was sort of too broad to explain whether or not attitudes towards gays and lesbians should be related towards an individual's sort of beliefs about their nation. So we argue that sort of not all beliefs or support for a sort of national identity are related to homophobia. To say that an individual is nationalist can mean a host of different things depending on the context. Just because you're interested in national poetry and country dancing doesn't necessarily mean that you sort of want to go out and attack gay people. So we wanted to sort of provide greater nuance in sort of our study of the relationship between nationalism and homophobia. And to do that, we drew on the literature from social psychology and argued that we should sort of make a distinction between nationalism as national in-group satisfaction and nationalism as national collective narcissism. So national in-group satisfaction is the belief that the membership of the nation is valuable and a source of pride and satisfaction. In other words, the nation and its achievements make members of the nation feel good about themselves, and they have an inclusive attitude towards minorities within the nation, as well as a cooperative approach in international relations. In the context of populist Central and Eastern Europe, however, we argue that the dominant national discourse is best captured by the concept of national collective narcissism. So national collective narcissism is defined as the belief that one's own group, the in-group, the nation in this case, is exceptional and entitled to privileged treatment, but is not sufficiently recognized by others. And so we argue that this understanding of nationalism is the best one to sort of explain homophobic attitudes. So we developed two hypotheses. The first is sort of a very general one, that higher national collective narcissism, whereby the in-group is defined in national terms, should predict higher levels of homophobia. So if an individual scores highly on national collective narcissism, then they're more likely also to be homophobic. But as I sort of discussed earlier, there are sort of a number of threats that homosexuality is believed to pose to the nation, sort of biological reproduction, cultural reproduction, religion, gender norms. But we didn't suggest that all sort of nations argue that all of these threats are sort of present at any one time. And from having analysed sort of the political discourse of politicians in Poland, we suggested that it's the threat to traditional gender norms that are seen to be the biggest threat that LGBT people pose to the Polish nation. So this was, I think, reflected in the quote by Kaczynski that I showed earlier, where he was worried that sort of homosexuality was a threat to sort of boys' and girls' identities, and they're taking on the natural roles of mother and father in adult life. So because of that, we developed a second hypothesis that national collective narcissism should predict homophobia via the belief that gender roles should be grounded in traditional national and religious values, which in turn predicts a tendency to uphold traditional beliefs in gender roles and the belief, therefore, that homosexuality is a threat to the nation. And so in order to test these hypotheses, we carried out two studies. And these were the results. Don't worry, I didn't understand it either. So my colleague Agnieszka took charge of this part of the project, and she had to sit me down several times and explain what it meant. But what it means, she assures me, is that there is a clear relationship between national collective narcissism and homophobia. Modern homonegativity is just sort of the name of the scale that we used as a proxy for homophobia. But what it particularly shows, we thought, is that it's the sort of the strength of belief about gender roles that sort of explains why people who score highly on national collective narcissism in Poland are more likely to be homophobic. Because in other sort of post-communist states, in Latvia, for example, where I've also sort of done research on the relationship between sexuality and homophobia and nationalism. In Latvia, when Latvia became independent in 1991, Latvians only constituted 52% of the population. 48% of the population were sort of Russian speakers. Most, but not all of whom had sort of migrated to Latvia during the communist period. So because of that, Latvian nationalists were sort of extremely concerned that their nation would actually die out. And therefore, the fact that gays and lesbians were not making a contribution to the biological reproduction was considered reason enough to sort of restrict the rights of LGBT people. But in Poland is highly ethnically homogenous. It's one of the most ethnically homogenous countries in Europe. And so it would make it difficult for sort of the idea that LGBT people are a threat to the biological reproduction sort of more difficult to take hold. So rather than being seen as a threat to the physical nation, homosexuality in Poland is understood as a threat to the patriarchal gender order underpinning the Polish nation. One interesting thing that we did find was that this relationship between national collective narcissism and homophobia was much weaker if individuals believed that people were born gay or lesbian. The trouble with that is that the Catholic Church is propagating this idea of sort of gender ideology and LGBT ideology, which supposedly is the aim of which is to sort of convert people, to sort of encourage them to choose to become gay. So these were sort of our main results, and so I just sort of wanted to finish by looking at some of the responses to the sort of the populist, homophobic rhetoric coming out of Poland and other Central and East European countries. So initially, there was very limited response from the international community, despite the fact that in the past Poland has undermined the rule of law, clamped down on freedom of association, contravened international refugee law. There was sort of very little pushback from other states of the European Union. However, it was the introduction of the LGBT-free zones that finally sort of provoked criticism from the Commission and various EU states. Polish municipalities which introduced these zones saw their funding, their EU funding, sort of withheld. Although the government in Warsaw said that they would sort of match any sort of funding that had been sort of withdrawn as a result of them standing up for the Polish nation, etc. Now, while sort of criticism from the West is commendable, this sort of international sort of Western criticism, support for LGBT rights, could end up playing into populist hands. Because again, it sort of reinforces this idea that homosexuality is Western, support for LGBT rights is Western, and again, these corrupt elites in Brussels are sort of forcing their views on us pure Polish people. So I think sort of an international response to these sort of homophobic policies is well-meaning, but often, I think, counterproductive. In Poland, in order to sort of counteract the idea that homosexuality is a Western import, a lot of Polish queer activists have sought to sort of reframe support for LGBT equality, not as a sort of an international human rights issue or a Europeanization issue, but something that is a sort of a Polish issue, so something that's sort of rooted in the politics of being Polish. So Polish activists have started incorporating Polish national symbols into their activism, sort of making a sort of a rainbow flag version of the Polish flag, the Polish symbol. They also did this with an image of the Virgin Mary, And unfortunately, that sort of resulted in the woman being taken to court for insulting religion, although quite surprisingly, I thought, she won her case, and this was seen as a freedom of speech issue. Also, in one of the sort of the equality parades in Warsaw, they chose the theme "Love Thy Neighbour," again to sort of show that you can be sort of queer and Polish and Catholic, as a lot of sort of queer Poles are. So this sort of local activism, and Poles have a great sort of history and reputation for sort of civil society activism, and so continuing with this sort of activism is extremely important. For as long as scapegoating the LGBT community proves to be a successful election strategy, as it was in the Polish presidential elections, as it has been in Russia, as it has been in Hungary, the instrumentalization of homophobia by populists is unlikely to disappear anytime soon. Thank you very much.
Which way it opens? Thank you. Right, there's a lot to take in there. For the last 15 years of my time at UCL, I was going to 70 to 80 inaugural lectures every year. So I've been to an awful lot of inaugural lectures. And I remain a passionate advocate of them, a wonderful fan of them. The reason why I like them particularly, although they are very strange events in the sense that no questions are taken, they are, if you like, statements of authority or statements of position, which is something that we encourage our students precisely to challenge, of course. But it is a wonderful tradition because the professor is actually, literally, professing their discipline, actually making a statement about the nature of their discipline, not simply about this is what I do, but also about why I do it and why it makes sense. And that's why I think it is a glorious tradition. But I'm also acutely aware that it is something which often strikes terror in the hearts of those about to give them, because this is, for many people, the one and only time in their entire professional lives when they will have to impress and make sense to specialists, colleagues from the departments, family, friends, people from outside, because one of the great traditions of this is that the inaugural lecture is open to everyone. So suddenly you have got the worst possible audience for a lecture because it's the most diverse, and for that diverse reason, it is actually the most important. So if you can see why it is such an extraordinary, bizarre, but wonderful event in the university's annual life. Now, we're all aware of the challenges within the region on which Richard has been focusing, and in fact is focusing in most of his research at the moment. We recognize that it's not the only place. There are many others where democracy is in recession and where populism, authoritarianism, and single-party rule are all in the ascendant. This is something that we're acutely aware of today, but which continues to make less and less sense to us. And the difficulty is our impotence. We can deplore populism, we can deplore nationalism, but what can we do about it beyond wringing our hands? And that is the question which academics must always face when analysing, anatomizing these particular phenomena. And that's what I think all of us would agree is something that Richard has done in a masterful way. Because what he's done is actually revealed to us the way in which politics, or the political, exercises its own power. Understanding how power operates is, if we go right the way back to the 16th century and Francis Bacon with his notion of knowledge is power, he doesn't simply mean that if you know everything, or if you know more than everybody else, you will actually be more powerful than anyone else. If you read his sacred meditations, from which that's taken, what he's arguing is that knowledge must be shared, and it is the sharing of knowledge which is actually what brings about influence and power. And that, in many ways, is the kind of argument that Richard was talking about in his demonstration of how politicians in Russia, in Hungary, in Poland, and indeed elsewhere, are using debate or discourse for their own sinister and dangerous reasons. Because they use discourse not only to expose their own strategies, their own aspirations, their own actions, but they're also articulating positions, intentions, aspirations. And if the anti-LGBT laws that Richard was talking about are bad enough, what I found chilling about his lecture was his very, very clear demonstration of how the impulses, the prejudices, the strategies of control behind these are more sinister and more dangerous, needing, though, as he was suggesting, to the need for different kinds of strategies. And I thought it was very interesting, you know, the allusion to the kind of strategies being either less public, more personal, of individuals and collectives in the LGBT communities across these countries. And when listening to him outline his hypotheses about national collective narcissism, I find this is actually quite worrying. It's something which is quite dangerous. And the way that he was talking about the instinctive, not only the instinctive responses of national collective narcissism, but also of those which are manufactured, that is what we need to be worried about, that kind of the manufacturing that goes on in these narcissisms. And I suspect that I wasn't the only person in this amphitheatre actually to have a sense of chill as I realised that things in Britain, in France, in Germany, in Western Europe are different perhaps only in degree, but not in essence. That actually we are having these same mechanisms being played out, and being played out more or less skillfully, as they are in Central Eastern Europe, but undoubtedly they are being used constantly. But on the other hand, and that's what is so good about the kind of work that political sociologists and that Richard particularly has been doing this evening, is that the knowledge that power is being exercised and understanding how and why it is being exercised is a vital step on the road, first of all, to resistance, then to defiance, and ultimately, in the utopia which we all carry about in our souls, to freedom. Knowledge and understanding. And in our world of misinformation, of disinformation, of fake news, we have desperate need of the forensic analyses of the academic community, and particularly, as I said, of political sociologists like Richard, who can rigorously expose in the sense of set out, but also unmask both falseness whenever and wherever it occurs, and also the effects of those falsenesses, and who can, at the same time, indicate to the LGBT communities and individuals how they can be empowered through that knowledge to act differently. And I think that Richard's lessons and the approaches that he was outlining to us today can, despite what you were saying at the end about how we may be very different in the West, we are very, very different, but I think that they can be applied mutatis mutandis to other countries, including our own. I'm not sure that we are, in essence, particularly more advanced. One only has to look at the workings of our current political leadership to see that there are similarities in the way that discourse is used for purposes other than for communication. And when I was listening to the lecture, I began to wonder even more widely. I find myself reflecting on the whole so what about this. When we've got this knowledge, what happens next? What are the implications of this? And what is the future for internationalization, to which so many of us clung, as it were, as the way forward in a modern liberal society? What was going to happen? I think we do recognize that the easy, I put easy in inverted commas, the easy globalization of the last 2 or 3 decades, has been exposed, has been revealed as more or less a manufactured fiction that we co-created across the world. But I'm not sure yet what exactly happened. Certainly, when I was listening to the latter part of his lecture, but it got me thinking about the importance of local context in our thinking about human rights. Rights to our own sexualities, rights to our own beliefs, and so on. And one thing that I was just actually thinking about today and thinking, can I make sense of this before I have to stand up before you all? And I haven't got there yet. I might talk to Richard and see if he's got any ideas. But I do think that one thing became clear to me is that after listening to Richard and trying to ponder while listening about the implications of what he was saying, is that we must, I think, now start to stop talking about the local and global dynamic. I think that opposition, which has been used by all kinds of people, both the brave, the good, the bad, the ugly, by everyone is using that dynamic to talk about the way in which we can and should live in the 21st century. I think we need to change that actually slightly to talk about a different dynamic, which is that of the global. We need still to think in terms of a conceptual notion of the global, but the dynamic would be of the global and contexts, without specifying, without implying any kind of pure geographical specificity to it. I do agree completely with what Richard was saying about the vital importance of, let's call them national specificities. But we also need to look at how that plays itself out against dynamics of local and global. So I certainly am already thinking, kind of pedaling as hard as I can to kind of make sense of some of the things that were catalyzed by Richard's talk. But before concluding, I'd like actually to pick up on something that he himself said in his introduction to himself about his interest in languages, because I think there's a very important part of the way that he thinks, having seen him since 2003, when I appointed him to the Mellon postdoc program, was the way that I just relished how he has always been so internationally minded in his work, intellectually, and also in his life. He's a great traveller. He loves travel. He loves going to other places. He loves to be in locations which are other in all kinds of ways. He's somebody who really suggests that he's getting a bit closer than most of us to the Dasein that Heidegger talks about, the being in the world, the time when you actually are living in something which is, let's call it the global. But importantly, he's a very committed linguist, and I commend him and admire him with wonder that he's choosing to learn Gaelic at the moment. Hey, how many of us in this room can say we've gone to learn a language like that? But why I think it's important is that it means that he can read and communicate in the languages of the countries that he is studying. But it also crucially means that he is deeply steeped in and constantly renewing his experience of the complex interplay of sameness and difference that is interlingual communication. And I think that's why we get the kind of richly multi-layered, complex presentation, such as he's given us today. And that's why I think there's a special richness to his research. So, Richard, on behalf of all of us, we owe you a great debt for all the ripples, the waves, perhaps the seismic tumulences that will pour over us as a result of the way that you have insisted that we change our thinking through your presentation. Thank you very much indeed, Richard, our Professor of Political Sociology. Please let us join.